Welcome to Scriptures Unveiled. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be discussing, or in our previous video, we discussed the spiritual understanding of the human consciousness, the divine consciousness. And the human consciousness have two components, which was this perceived separated ego and the divine ego. And so today we're going to be discussing how we can see in the life of Peter how the human consciousness and the divine consciousness come together as one through a bridging process. And in that bridging process, we see how that separated ego is crucified and transitions to a divine ego, which serves. So we'll be starting off in Matthew 16, 21 and 23. Where, when we see Peter, he's just like the perfect example.
Yeah, it's when he's Jesus is foretelling his death.
Yes.
So I'll read it. So it starts 21. So from the time Jesus Christ began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the third day. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned, this is Jesus, and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. So basically, when Peter wanted to stop Jesus from being killed, that was his perceived separated ego. And I always put in perceived because it's really an illusion.
It's false.
Yeah, it's false.
Yes.
And that was his false ego talking. And he was protecting, wanting to protect Jesus, but also himself from the suffering and the pain.
Yes.
And Peter said, just before that, actually, we're not going to go over it, but just before that, actually, is when Peter said, You are the Christ. So basically, Peter was assuming that Jesus being the Son of God, because he had that revelation from the Father, that he shouldn't endure suffering, meaning Jesus shouldn't endure that suffering. Exactly. And that's such a false assumption that you can avoid suffering in this world. Absolutely.
That is so true, because just like Peter thinking that Jesus is the Son of God, he shouldn't, endure any suffering. That sounds so familiar. It does, because many of us run from suffering.
Yes.
Instead of embracing it, we feel the entitlement that we should escape it. And so by any means necessary, we really try to escape suffering, to not endure suffering. Right. But in actuality, suffering is not necessarily bad. I call it the pleasurable pain. And why? Because suffering serves as that portal. We're talking about the bridging process. So it serves as a portal or an opportunity to encounter oneness with that divine consciousness and that human consciousness.
Right.
When we endure suffering in the heart, it opens us up for that union.
Yes.
So for when we're trying to escape it, and we'll see it actually becomes a stumbling block. So we're to embrace it with its pleasurable pain, because and also suffering is not discriminative. So in other words, everyone's definition of suffering is different. There's variations. And so we'll see that there's variations of our suffering, but that suffering is the portal.
That's the portal.
Yes.
Yeah, it sure is. And so in verse 23, actually, the last one we did, an interesting thing is it says, but he turned, and that's Jesus, and said to Peter. And in the original Greek interlinear Bible, that it says having turned.
Yes.
Meaning Jesus having turned. So really that's different. It doesn't mean he turned, he turned that way. That was the turning inside.
Yes.
That he already went through, the process that he went through with this bridging process. Because he had to endure all the same things we did. He was human.
Yes.
As well as divine. Like we're human and divine. So we have to go through the same process.
Yes.
And so this is what he's revealing there.
Yes, that's so good.
Yeah, and so I thought that was really important. So he says, "Get behind me, Satan." He's not talking to Peter. It's not Peter. So that he's talking about.
It's not. And even that word get behind, that word get behind in Greek actually means to follow or to return home.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And so that's wonderful.
Yeah, that is.
And so when he's saying get behind me, he's not, he's saying he's returned home.
Yes, Jesus himself.
Jesus himself.
And this is what happens to us.
Right.
Because he's that definition or that forerunner of what happens to us.
So you are not setting your mind on God's, but God's interest, but man's is that's not his home. Because that is the perceived separated ego.
It is.
So it's giving us that example. Man's interest is fulfilling our human desire, not wanting to suffer.
Yes.
And so in that case here.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so then he talks about where Satan is. And you said Satan in the Greek?
Yes. Satan in the Greek actually means divided or against himself. So what we're seeing is that perceived separated ego that is causing Peter not wanting to have Jesus endure suffering because it's divided from itself, meaning it's divided from its divine consciousness, the divinity that's within us.
Right.
That's the actual characteristic or definition of Satan. It's just us coming against that divinity that's within. It's dividing the two.
Dividing it.
Yes.
Yeah, and that separated ego that defends, it defends its existence.
Yes.
By any means necessary. And here we see in our separated ego, we see it here, but also I want to say what happens to us is that we as humanity has created Satan in our own imagination, meaning he occupies that separated ego. So what happens is we imagined Satan so that we could deflect the blame on another.
Absolutely.
So we blame it on him.
Yes.
It's a means of self-protection.
Self-protection in an unhealthy manner. Because in the perceived separated ego, which is actually false or an illusion, Satan exists within that place.
Right.
Of that perceived separated ego.
Yes, he does.
Meaning he's an illusion.
He is.
Satan's a false.
Yep.
It's originating from what? That separation.
The separation.
That perceived separation.
Right.
Which only knows what? Division.
Yeah. So Jesus was, was saying that this is a stumbling block. And so he wasn't going to get caught in that trap again. Because he knew. He knew the separated ego was a stumbling block, and he's not going back there.
Yes.
So Jesus gave us a picture of us with a divine ego that serves. And that's that bridging. That's what we're bridging to. Is a divine ego that serves.
Yes. So that human consciousness and the divine consciousness can come together as one.
Yes.
So you see it in Jesus. Why? Because he embraced the suffering.
Right.
The divine ego was able to serve. Right. And in that serving, he's embracing that suffering. And we see that as an example.
As an example.
And that's same with us.
Yep, same with us.
We're to embrace suffering.
And
in that suffering, we come into that divine ego that serves, and the two become one.
So this is step one for Peter.
Yes. The suffering.
But we have like about four
other examples.
4 more, so which will show us the whole bridging process.
Yes.
So thanks for watching. If you'd like, make a comment, subscribe, or hit the like button.